Apresentar o professor Malina, that will be our next speaker. Please take your place for a 60-minute lecture. Portanto, o professor Malina vai proferir uma comunicação de 60 minutos, seguir-se-á conforme o programa que estava incluído na pasta, uma mesa redonda que também com a coordenação anunciada pelo professor Dr. António Marques. Ao pedirem para apresentar o professor Robert Malina, ocorreu-me tirar 4 ou 5 notas, sobretudo para relevar um percurso de um bom estudante que, nascido em Nova Iorque, na Manhattan College, fez a sua licenciatura em Educação Física com uma duração de 3 anos. Seguiu para o Wisconsin, quase ao pé do Canadá, onde fez, em 3 anos, o mestrado e o doutoramento em Educação Física. Faz um segundo doutoramento na Pensilvânia em Antropologia Física. Portanto, licenciatura, mestrado, doutoramento em Educação Física e um segundo doutoramento em Antropologia Física. Uma mobilidade de conhecimento muito antes da Europa começar a fazer declarações de Bolonha. Se tenho as minhas dúvidas como académico sobre a produção de efeitos de Bolonha, quando olho para o currículo do professor Malina, vejo que o enunciado, a formulação da necessidade de combinar saberes é válida, há muita reserva de conhecimento entre áreas científicas e não tanto reservas de conhecimento dentro de uma área científica específica. Realçava esse facto. E o percurso do professor Malina é depois consubstanciado num conjunto de indicadores de produtividade. Ontem, ao auscultar a secretária de Estado com responsabilidades na educação, no ensino superior e na investigação, há uma necessidade, num país que tem recursos restritos, de prestar contas. A prestação de contas do professor Malina ontem, no que diz respeito à comunidade de Ciências de Desporto, foi muito bem feito pelo Dr. João Paulo Vilas Boas. O professor Malina tem 400 artigos publicados com arbitragem e medição de impacto. É discutível, mas é um indicador de produtividade consensualmente aceito na comunidade científica. E orientou 43 teses doutorais, tanto na sua área de Educação Física e Ciências do Desporto, como também em Antropologia Física. E daí resultou que tem sido alvo, ou tem recebido, doutoramentos honoris causa, honoríficos, na Universidade Católica de Leuven, em Cracóvia, em Wrocław e na Universidade de Coimbra em 2008. Portanto, em 6 doutoramentos, 4 honoríficos, 2 de estudo, sentado à secretária. Não que os outros tenham sido brincadeira. É section editor de múltiplos jornais e foi 11 anos editor-in-chief da American Journal of Human Biology, que é uma revista preponderante e que também ali teve a preocupação de combinar saberes. Mas um último dado relevante sobre o currículo do professor Malina é dizer que por 3 mandatos consecutivos foi presidente da Associação Americana de Educação Física. E isto também foi ontem realçado no discurso político. A necessidade de nós não nos fecharmos naquilo que foi ontem dito como Torres de Marfim, mas vertermos o nosso conhecimento com responsabilidade profissional. Portanto, é com este enquadramento, com esta moldura, que eu apresento o professor Robert Malina. Before the final 5 minutes, I will say my yellow card, but usually you manage very well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Mr. President and colleagues from Portugal, I'm grateful to the Portuguese Olympic Committee for this opportunity to visit your lovely country once again. My first visit to Portugal was before most of you were born, in 1966. And I was probably among the first passengers to drive over the new bridge at the time over the Tagu River. But now, of course, you have another bridge, and I've not been over that one yet. But I've been back and forth to Portugal almost once a year since the mid-90s. And I feel very much at home, and I'm grateful to be back. And it will be enjoyable for me again, and I hope the next hour is enjoyable and illuminating for some of you. I would like to spend the next hour or so speaking about the training of young athletes. And my focus, I want to emphasize, is the young athlete. We're talking about children and adolescents. And what I would like to do is give a brief overview of concepts related to talent. It's a magic word we hear very often. Readiness, when is the child ready for sport? Trainability, how do they respond to training? And the whole issue, which is very popular and current nowadays, of specialization in sport. But when you talk about children, keep in mind, their main purpose being here is they have to grow up. I call that the business of growing up. They must physically grow. They get bigger. The body composition changes. They must biologically mature, make progress to the mature state, and they must learn to behave as we expect them in their culture development. The three processes, growth, maturation, and behavioral development, they take place at the same time. And very importantly, they interact. Biology and behavior interact. You see it in childhood and especially in adolescence. These interactions influence the skills and behaviors of children, and they influence the interactions between the youngsters and adults. And in the context of sport, you're talking about interactions between children, adolescents, and their coaches, or if you like, the sport environment. All too often we focus on training, but you forget these are youngsters. They're learning to develop, to behave, and we often overlook that fact when we work with youngsters in the context of sport. Talent. It's a magic word. What is talent? You look it up in a dictionary, they will say it's a special, unique aptitude. We're interested in, can we identify youngsters with this kind of aptitude for sport? How do we select them? How do we develop them? When you work with youngsters in sport, you are basically dealing with potential. Potential for what? Success, however we define it. If you go back to the former Eastern Europe, you go to China, success means medals in international competitions. Elite status, high-level performance. In US, potential for scholarships, and so on. Now, whether or not the individual attains his or her potential, there are many intervening and influencing factors along the way. Talent in sport is often described as including any number of characteristics. You could put them into 5 or 6 categories. The first is physical. Do they have the size, physique, requirements of a particular sport? Is it affected by their biological maturation? What are their functional capacities, be it aerobic, anaerobic, speed, power, flexibility, and so on? Movement proficiency or skill, we take that for granted. Athletes are typically highly skilled in the movements necessary for their sport. Perceptual and cognitive skills. These get less attention, but they're very, very important. Anticipation, reaction time, visual search. How do you teach these kind of skills? I'm from a product of the streets of New York and Brooklyn. I played baseball growing up, my main sport. How do you teach a child to begin running at the crack of the bat to go chase a ball and know where it's going to land? You take that for granted. Of course, there are many psychological skills, coping behaviors, motivation, attention, and behavior in general. And then a word often used in the sports literature called game intelligence or sport intelligence, whatever that means. And the word intelligence intrigues me, and I was interested in the notion of Howard Gardner, who's put out a theory of multiple intelligences. And he includes actually 7 or 8, but 2 I think are highly relevant to sport. He describes one being bodily kinesthetic intelligence, which he defines as the potential of using the body or parts of the body to solve problems. Another one is spatial intelligence, the potential to recognize and use patterns of wide space or more confined spaces. If you think about sports, This is what sports are all about. You're using your body to solve problems associated with spaces. If you watch your football, soccer is a game of spaces. How do you play the spaces and see the space? When you do an individual sport like gymnastics, you're controlling your body. Or diving. This is, how do you handle your body going through space? In the context of talent, there's a lot of vocabulary out there, and some of it's somewhat arbitrary. And I'll give you at least my perceptions of this literature. The first you always hear, talent detection. And in many cases, they're talking about people who are non-participants in the sport. How can we get potentially talented individuals into a given sport? And then another word that comes with detection is identification. And this more or less, in most cases, refers to the current participants in the sport. How do we identify those who have talent for success in a specific sport? So these are very general terms you hear in this literature all the time. Talent detection is not a problem for many sports because many sports have a relatively large pool of participants, and often beginning at quite early ages. But there are exceptions. The biggest one in the U.S. is the sport of diving. Very few children go out for diving. Why? There are no more diving boards in public pools. The lawyers took them out. If you're in a pool, you jump off the board, you get hurt, they go to court. So getting youngsters to diving is a very difficult problem. In the 90s, we had a committee, U.S. Junior Olympic Diving, where we tried to figure out how can we get youngsters into the sport. And this is a problem, I think, for many lesser-known sports. How do I identify my sport to youngsters? Because they're being attracted by the major sports in a society. And then related is, in many different parts of the world, even within developed countries, you have inequality of access to programs. It could be by social class. In the U.S., swimming is basically a middle and upper class sport. By ethnicity, and nowadays with many single parent families, access is becoming progressively different. And also, how is the sport perceived by society? In the U.S., volleyball and field hockey are perceived as sports for girls. You cannot get boys into those sports. Now, perceptions are changing. So these are things that you must consider when you want to get youngsters involved in different kinds of sports. Now, talent development is a process. We're hoping we can help individuals realize their talent. In doing so, we try to give them an optimal learning and training environment. All too often we think of the sport environment, but this also includes the adults involved. They're part of the environment. And we need to take that into consideration. Now, in selection, we're trying to identify those youngsters who we think are most appropriate for a given sport or for an event or discipline or position within a sport. And this is sometimes difficult. A child may want to be a defender, but we think you're better off being a midfielder. Or a parent thinks my child is going to be this, when in fact he should be this. That's a problem, these kind of perceptions of what's going on. Now, the process, like any other process, typically has any number of stages. Well, once you get through the detection or initial identification, then you select. An important part we often overlook is retention. How do we retain that child in a sport? And this is very often a two-edged sword, because by me retaining that child in a sport, am I not giving him or her an opportunity to do better in another sport that she may or he may be more suited for? I'll give you an example. I was once at a committee meeting with USA Gymnastics, USA Diving, USA Tennis, and USA Swimming. And I asked the woman from USA Gymnastics, hypothetically, if you've got a girl in gymnastics whom you know is talented but will not make it to the next level. Would you give her up to another sport? She said, no. I said, why? She said, we need the money. So now, this is a very serious question. Now, as a coach, for example, when do I give up the youngster to a better coach? Or if this youngster might be better in a different sport. So it's a big business. I remember talking to the man who, I guess, initially coached Wayne Rooney. I was giving a lecture at Liverpool, and we got into the whole idea of youngsters, and he said, we knew Wayne Rooney was talented at 6 years of age. We had to keep him in our sport because he could have done any other sport he wanted. So there's this whole literature rarely talks about retention, but it's a difficult concept because you're dealing with youngsters' lives. Now, he or she may be better in another sport, yet I need him in my sport because of my ego. So something to keep in mind. The whole issue of developing and nurturing talent, this is central throughout the process. It's ongoing, and it takes time to do it. Now, the development is dependent on, as I said earlier, the learning and training environments of specific sports. This means you have to study what goes on in the club, in the gymnasium, in the sports schools, not just the field. What goes on? Who's running the club? What's going on? This is what I mean by the sport environment. Training is one part of that. The part that we most often focus on is the systematic instruction, practice, training aimed at nurturing the emerging talent and perfecting this talent as youngsters progress from the beginning through the intermediate to the more final stages. It's an ongoing process. Now, if you want to put it very simply, the success or failure of many programs, to me, is simply dependent on a balance between the characteristics of the youth athletes and the demands of the sport or sports system. And what you're essentially looking at is the balance between youngsters and adults. We often overlook that fact. Adults run the sports programs, the youngsters are the athletes. We have a balance, and not many people take that balance into effect. A concept that often appears in talent development is the concept of readiness. In many ways, in my mind, it's kind of the match, or if you like, the fit between the characteristics of the young athletes and the demands of the sport. You got to balance. Once again, it's a message I think often overlooked when you work with youngsters versus adults. How does the sport match up with the needs and the characteristics of the child? Demands of the sport, I think, are fairly straightforward. You've got the objectives, the tasks, the rules. Many sports, professionals constantly break the rules to get away with it. Techniques and skills, tactics and strategies. These are pretty well enumerated in many of your technical manuals. Then, of course, you've got the physical demands, physiological demands, and behavioral demands of the sport. These are highly variable. And these are influenced in many ways by the perceptions of coaches. Coaches have some idea what they want from a young athlete in a particular sport. Whether the perceptions are correct or not, I don't know. But you have to face that fact. How a coach perceives a young athlete could influence how he or she is going to develop. What do we know about the characteristics of young athletes? Actually, quite a bit in some areas. We have reasonable data on the physical growth characteristics of young athletes in a variety of sports. A fairly good data on their biological maturation, and in many sports, especially boys more than girls, you see selection along biological maturity related gradient. If you're working with boy athletes or male athletes, up to 9, 10, 11, very little difference. Once you get into 12, 13, 14, 15, puberty, the early maturing boys have an advantage. In gymnastics, just the opposite. No difference at 6, 7, 8, 9 years of age. 10, 11 years of age, the late maturers take over the sport. These are real. how do you cope with that when you're a coach? And we'll get into that later on. There's a lot less than functional characteristics. These are well documented in the sports science literature. When it comes to sports-specific skills, relatively little data on the development of these skills and the refinement of these skills. And coaches know what they're looking for. To me, this would be fun to get in. How does a youngster really develop the sport-specific skills? We take it for granted because many of the youngsters can simply do them. Very limited data for perceptual cognitive skills. And there's really a lack of how these skills develop and how do we refine them. And when it comes to behavior, forget it. Negligible behavioral data. Most studies of behavior in sport focus on parents, parent-child interactions, parent-coach interactions, the home environment, case studies, and what's always in the press are the anomalous behaviors. If an athlete goofs up, everybody knows about it. So you could ask the question, how do training environments influence the behavioral development of children? I don't know the answer to that. What behaviors are expected or what behaviors are tolerated in specific sports? My wife was a middle school mathematics teacher, which means 6th, 7th, 8th grade. The pressures on the teachers, subtle as ever, to move youngsters along, not because they're good students, they're good athletes. They're tolerated, and they get away with it. This begins early in life. So we need to look at the behavioral development of athletes. This, to me, would be fascinating, but does not receive enough attention. The anomalies get the attention. Most of them are perfectly fine. So talent development programs, they must accommodate what I call the dynamic nature of normal growth, biological maturation, and behavioral development. This is a review. The interaction of these processes are important. Biology is interacting with behavior. And it's a dynamic process. And these processes are highly individualized. There's probably no set rule how to do it for everybody. You must recognize and tolerate individual differences and cope with them. Now, two concepts are related, or you often hear in talent development programs: trainability and coachability. I'm not even sure coachability is a word, but you very often hear these terms when you're working with young athletes. Trainability, this is straightforward. It's the responsiveness of the individual to training, to instruction, to practice, to the sport environment. How does a youngster respond to the situation? It varies obviously with age, with maturity, with developmental characteristics, and is highly individual. And very often you say, here's the question, how trainable is she? How trainable is he? It's a legitimate question. How are they going to respond to the training environment? We tend to think of that physiologically, but to me, an important part of this is the behavioral trainability or responsiveness to the environment. They go hand in hand. Coachability. You can almost take that and modify the words. The responsiveness of the youngster to coaching or to a specific coach. And this probably varies considerably with coaching styles. Also with athlete perceptions of the coaches. This is a field that has not really been sufficiently studied. I do not want to offend any coaches in the room, but the whole issue of how the coach regulates the environment of the sport needs further study. So you ask the question, how coachable is the individual child? It all depends on the coach, young athlete interactions. And they are not uniform, and they probably change with age, come puberty, they change altogether. Ask any parent. No, this is perfectly normal behavior. Now, these are some related questions to the issues. When is an individual ready for training in a given sport? Or Are there specific periods during childhood and adolescence when an individual is more sensitive to the training stimulus? Are these critical? It's a term here in developmental psychology. Are there critical periods for behavior development? Do such periods exist? If they do exist, they are often viewed as a window of opportunity for the development of skills or functions. By inference, it implies that during these critical periods, the youngster is much more responsive to training. Perhaps it's a period during which they are selected or excluded from a sport. Keep in mind, when you think of selection for a sport, that also includes exclusion. Some are selected, most are not. We often overlook that opposite of the term. Now, I think there are two windows that are implicit in virtually all talent development models. And many of these models go back to the former Eastern Europe. They've been modified for US, modified for China, modified down under. But many models seem to imply that during early or middle childhood, this is a primary window for skill development. It makes perfect sense because this is when youngsters are learning their basic movement skills. But one trade-off here is emphasis on early skill development is, I think, influencing decisions for parents to start their children in sport very early and to specialize very early. We'll get into specialization in a minute. But then during adolescence, this is where they think your functional characteristics or functional capacities are very trainable. And Vic Catch wrote this back many years ago. He called it the trigger hypothesis, meaning there's increased sensitivity to muscular and cardiovascular development associated with training with the pubertal environment. In other words, with the hormones of puberty, with rapid growth in body size, muscle mass, and so on, these capacities, muscular and cardiovascular, are more trainable. It's easier said than done. Now, let's put this in current context. Probably the most popular model for talent development on the market nowadays is that by Istvan Bali, called long-term athlete development. Istvan is from Hungary, and to me, this is probably the most recent iteration of the East European models. If you read the models that preceded this one, they all pretty much have similar characteristics with a couple modifications. This model's got two tracks. One is early specialization, one is late specialization. Most of the papers on the long-term athlete development model speak very little about the early specialization track. And it applies mostly to girls, especially artistic and rhythmic gymnastics, diving, figure skating, and more recently, table tennis. The late specialization track has got very serious steps. If you notice, they say fundamental skills, emphasizes fun. Question you can ask about the early, where's the fun part? But in a late specialization track, most emphasis right now is on the train-to-train part, adolescence. And this I will get into in a second. So this, I think, is right now the most popular model. Questions. Do athletes in the early specialization track miss out on fun? It's a very serious question. Are the movement skills in place before they go into these tracks? Now, the late specialization, obviously earlier for girls, given the sex difference in timing of puberty, but emphasis on the train-to-train. This is the interval of the growth spurt they call peak height velocity. This is the timing of biological maturation. And the question that surfaces, how accurately can you predict peak height velocity? Because in growth studies, you do this with longitudinal data, where you follow the youngster for 6 or 7 years. It's after the fact. But in this model, they want you to predict it. And I think it's going to raise many questions. You'll get into those in a second. So let's look at the early specialization track. What is early specialization? This is year-round participation or training in a single sport, beginning at a relatively early age. And in this track, emphasis on the identification and development of potentially talented youth, both formally and informally, and this has contributed to early specialization. Talent ID programs, I think, foster early specialization in some sports. And if you look at it, I think the search for talent at young ages is probably much more prevalent and very structured compared to the past. These are some examples. You've got formal programs that are national. You know, Podium 2008, Podium 2012, Podium 2016. All they're looking for is medals. Tennis, gymnastics, figure skating schools. You've got the International Management Group in Florida. It's a big business. The stated purpose to develop talented athletes. All over the world, in soccer, you have academies. Baseball, in the Caribbean, academies for the purpose of producing players for eventually getting into the big leagues. In the U.S., we have what I call rogue high schools. These are diploma mills for basketball players. They're all over the country. If you're a talented basketball player in U.S. high school basketball, you're basically a free agent. You go wherever you want to go to school. Then in many U.S. school sports, you've got select teams for basketball, soccer, baseball, softball, volleyball. And the select team coaches, they are essentially brokers. They're the middlemen between the college coaches and the youngsters. And of course, you got many other special camps. So I think this is going on at all levels. And no, we tend to overlook it, but it's there. It's very structured. The roots of specialization in sport are, I think you can trace in part to Eastern European talent ID programs. They go back to the post-World War II and so on. So former Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, they have had these places pretty well in place. Tudor Bampa, he's former Romanian, migrated to West like many of them did, and he keeps talking about as scientific selection at very young ages. But I think if you look at their programs more carefully, they did participate year-round in the sport, but they did not specialize that early, except in gymnastics and a few of those special sports. Because most of the early part of their models, if you look at them, were general, what they call multilateral skills. In many of their programs, you train, specialize in adolescence. And like everything in the world, there's a tendency to copy successful programs. And all of these were extended and modified in the West. And of course, eventually to China. And with the collapse of the former Soviet system, many migrated to the West. They became instant experts. Why? Because most people in the West can't read the Eastern European languages. That's how you find out. I'm Polish background. I've been very lucky. I studied Polish in school for 12 years. Had no choice. My grandparents, on my mother's side, only spoke Polish, so I could read a lot of that literature. It's pretty much, the same old. But I've had the good luck of being able to read some original reports. Now, another factor affecting specialization nowadays is what I call the over-organization of childhood. And this is associated with changes in our lifestyles and the demands on families in developed countries. Children are increasingly placed in organized activities, be it academic, be it social, be it sport, at very young ages. What's driving this? These are several that surfaced in a discussion we had at the Aspen Institute. Increased in the number of single-parent or dual working parent families. In other words, there's major need for after-school care and preschool care. State mandates for standardized testing. In the U.S., you trace this to George W. Bush. No child left behind. With that mandate, recess in most public schools disappeared. So now you have after-school classes and tutoring to prepare for the state exams. The professionalization of parenthood. There are many pressures on parents to raise high-achieving children. Just read the newspapers or watch TV shows. It's very real. And in U.S., I know competition for college admission. Parents talk about building their child's resume. This is what's driving a lot of this. And for sports, these are some other reasons. Parents want to give their youngster a chance, give them a head start. Well, let's give them an edge. Why? Everybody's doing it. Or Tiger Woods. If it's good for him, it's good for everybody else. Look how screwed up Tiger Woods is now. Economic. Many parents perceive future earnings in their child. They're marketing their child. In U.S., pursuit of scholarships. But this is going on all over now. Because there are schools in Europe who are focusing on athletes for the purpose of getting them a scholarship in U.S. If you want a good exercise, go to the rosters of university teams and see how many of them came from Europe or nowadays from Africa for the basketball programs. And there are probably others. So there are many pressures for this. Also, I think a factor in specialization is expertise research in psychology. This is the so-called 10 years of experience or 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Very popular theme in literature. And I believe this drives some parents and coaches to have children specialize early. What's expert performance? It's a quote from Erickson, whose idea it was. Acquired characteristics resulting from extended deliberate practice. Most of the research in this area comes from non-sport activities, specifically chess, music, and math. And a couple selected sports, golf and tennis. Team sports are virtually non-existent in this literature. Of course, team sports are very unique. Teammates are a buffer. In the field of cognitive perceptual psychology, they very often generalize from non-sport specific measures to athletes in actual competitive situations. Very dangerous because you don't know if it applies. And they rarely look at biological variables. This is an example from the work of Mark Williams, who's done a lot of work on soccer. Non-specific tests of visual function did not differentiate skilled from less skilled youth soccer players. But less skilled players often perform better than skilled players on non-sport-specific perceptual cognitive tests. So what might work in a laboratory may not work in reality. It's something to keep in mind. So, expertness, interesting, but keep in mind, developing talent is a very complex process. At the expense of repeating myself, it includes not only behavior, but many biological variables, and extends over many years. And in this literature, what you never read about are the teachers and coaches. They always indicate as being very important, but rarely do they get into the fact what characteristics of teachers and coaches facilitate the development of expert performance. These are not ordinarily considered. And you could extend this to what I call the culture of the sport, the culture of artistic gymnastics. What does that do to a child? How does he or she survive in that culture? Or the culture of gymnasium, the culture of a club. This is important. We need to study that. And let's look at the right side of the track, the late specialization model, where they emphasize the period of adolescence. Sex differences are real. They emphasize the growth spurt. How accurately can this be done? Let's look at the reality of the adolescent growth spurt. It's very, very real. And studies from England, Switzerland, Poland, Belgium, US, Canada, this is the normal range of variability in individual ages at peak height velocity. In girls, they can range from 9 to 15. If the peak height velocity occurs at 9, that means they began the process a year or two earlier than that. from boys 11 to 17. You also have growth spurts in other body dimensions that often are overlooked, and they do not occur at the same time as a growth spurt in height. In other words, puberty is not an organized package. For example, your legs and other measurements of the lower body typically have their growth spurts before peak height velocity. Some data suggest measures of speed and flexibility have their adolescent spurts before peak height velocity. Peak oxygen consumption, VO2 max, at the same time as peak height velocity. Body weight, lean tissue mass, bone mineral, fat mass, sitting height, your trunk measurements after peak height velocity. Strength and power after peak height velocity. You're playing with a very highly individualized set of characteristics that do not go through puberty at the same time. So by focusing on height, what are you doing? I'm not sure. Now, evidence suggests, and this is from a recent review from McNary and colleagues in England, that the responses of youngsters to aerobic training, strength training, speed training are not consistent within a maturation threshold. And if you look at another paper from England by Ford, looking at the principles of the long-term athlete development model, he said the data are lacking to support this model. So I think we need to look at it very, very critically. Now, estimates of peak height velocity, as I said earlier, require longitudinal data. But there's considerable interest in predicting when age at peak height velocity will occur. There's a prediction equation, sex-specific, they're out there, being widely used and unfortunately blindly used and uncritically used. This protocol has major limitations and has major risk of misclassification. I've seen it applied to young girls, gymnasts at 6 or 7 years of age. Come on. People do it at 9, 10 years of age. Major limitations. I'll give you a couple limitations. It depends on how old the kid is when you predict. It depends on whether they are biologically early or late. It's got a very marked reduced range of variability in the predictions. And within individuals, predictions can range from here to here, depending on what age when you predict. So if you are tied to this protocol for predicting peak height velocity, be very, very careful. It's not as accurate as you think it is. I think it works for average maturing boys around the time of the growth spurt. It doesn't work for girls. It doesn't work for early maturing boys. It doesn't work for late maturing children, both sexes. So be very, very careful with this. An issue that surfaces also in talent programs is, oh, it's in the genes or it's the environment. It's basically, this is a nature-nurture argument. And very often people involved get very polarized. No, well, it's mine. No, they're both very, very important. You can't have one without the other. Your genetic makeup, your genotype, very important role in talent. But it's usually discussed in terms of physical or physiological characteristics, but very less often in terms of performance and behavioral characteristics. But keep in mind, virtually all of our biological characteristics, there's some really important ones excluded, are multifactorial, meaning they involve genes, they involve the environment, and they involve interactions between your genes and the environment. These studies typically report a heritability statistic. This statistic applies to populations. It does not apply to individuals. There are always exceptions to the rules. And in our field, most of the focus of heritability work has been on strength, aerobic capacity. Most of them were done on adults, some on youth, with invasive techniques, muscle biopsies purely on adults, very limited data for athletes. Now they're looking for candidate genes. They're doing genome scans. And I was talking to Claude Bouchard not too long ago. He says it hasn't been too successful yet. Because there's a project going on looking at adults with incredibly high VO2 maxes. They've yet to find any candidate markers that they'll say this guy will be good or this woman will be good. So it's going on. There's a lot of individual differences in training, and these in part depend on your genetic makeup. If you look at this, people of the same family tend to respond to the same programs just pretty much in a similar manner. But this has not been studied in the context of skill, and specifically sports skills. I would expect similar results, but it's not been studied. So, talent development is a long-term process. Then you can ask, what's the expected success rate? And of course, what's your measure of success? Talent programs have very high dropout rates or high exclusion rates. And it's always the issue of when do you move to the next level? When do I move you to a new coach? And so on. Two examples. In USA Gymnastics, women, about 83,000 participants. This is 2010, 2011. Look at the elite line, 109, 0.13%. This is what you're working with. In USA Soccer, they're doing this now. We have about 1.5 million boys play high school soccer, participate in youth soccer, 400,000 in high school. The academies, you're talking about 0.4%. So you're talking about a very exclusive group of youngsters, and many had dropped out along the way. This is some estimates of success. A paper summarizing the Russian situation by Liak, who's now in Poland. Of their 35,000 members of their child and youth sports schools, 0.14%, about 50, eventually reached sporting excellence at the senior level. In Germany, about 5,000 athletes in 7 Olympic sports, a 7-year follow-up, 0.3%, or 15, selected at the youngest level, eventually ranked among the 10 best internationally. Another survey, about 11,000 athletes in 3-year follow-up in elite sports schools, less than 2%, 192, attained a medal in international senior championship. In US, we have a lot of high school data. You've got the first column is the number of high school seniors, their 4th-year high school. The number of first-year college players, the percentage go to college. College seniors, the percentage drafted by the pros. And then you got the percentages. The whole thing is highly unlikely to make it. In American baseball is a little bit different because they have their own farm system where you could be drafted, where you're going to start out at what they call triple A, the lowest level. You may make $600, $700 a month. But by the time very few of them make it to the top level. But you just look at the chance to go from high school to professional, 0.03%. College to professional, a little bit better, but not much. Everybody wants a college scholarship. In the U.S., less than about 2% of girls and 2% of boys get scholarships to go from high school sport to college sport. And of those, they are mostly partial scholarships. In other words, your parents better have money. The only sports with full scholarships are football and basketball. Give you an example. A baseball team typically has 25 players in college. There are 11 scholarships for those 25 players. So most get what they call partial scholarships. So it's not what people think it is. Does specialization work? This is from a study done in Australia about moving up from junior and senior levels. So they tracked the time youngsters went from novice to junior, novice to senior. And what they found out, wow, there's a lot of variability. And so Oldenziel and colleagues looked at the quick and slow progressors. Those who were quick, most of them came from individual sports. They played, on average, 3 sports before they specialized, compared to those in the slow track, did basically 1 sport. And they began their main sport much later. those from novice to senior, once again, mostly in individual sports. They played more sports, and they began later than those who went the slow track, which typically began earlier and did very few other sports. No difference between junior and senior to speak of. But this needs to be done. It's hard to do. And recently, from Germany once again, only 64% of the international finalists and 53% of the top athletes all were played in other sports. And these successful athletes also played sports for a longer period of time. But of interest, juvenile competitive success was not a good predictor of later success. It explained a very, very small percentage of the variance. It's something to keep in mind. These are my own data from women athletes at Texas. We had 7 sports. And you can see on your far left when the ages they began, wide variability. Most of them played several sports. And specialization earliest in swimming, then diving, 10, 11, tennis. Then you got all at 13, 14. That's when school sports take over in the U.S. Swimming and diving are pretty much club sports, as are tennis. But notice, virtually all of them did more than one sport. Exceptions were swimmers. So what are the implications of low success rates? I don't know. The important thing is there's variable trajectories to go from one level to an elite level. Most elite athletes played several sports before specializing. And many of them reached the elite levels with less than 10 years specialized training. If you follow this literature, and it's excellent work of Jean Coté in Canada, what we used to call free play is now called developmental play. And Jean Coté's work is superb, talking about let children sample different sports before you get them to specialize. Now, this was a fascinating paper. I'm just about done. Came out from, I believe, Denmark. They called it CGS sports, sports measured in centimeters, grams, and seconds. Canoeing, kayaking, cycling, rowing, orienteering, sailing, skiing, swimming, track and field, triathlon, weightlifting. They compared the elite and near elite, the elite were your world level or successful junior competitions. Unfortunately, the data are combined for men and women. But if you look at the practice time of elite versus near elite, at age 9, the elite did 114 hours per year, about less than half what the near elite did. At 12, about half of what the near elite did. At 15, about 2/3. At 18, about equivalent. At 21, they did more. In other words, the elite did not spend nearly as much time practicing a specific sport than the near elite. They both spent the same time in other sports. And look at the time difference in ages. When did the elite initiate the sport? Close to 12. The near elite, 9. Developmental stages, 15 versus 13. Perfection, 18 versus 6. First national championship, 14 versus 12. International competition, 17 versus 15. You can see the differences. It gives you insights when you start looking at different sports. It may not be the same you see in those sports most often studied. So, in summary, when you're coming to working with talent in sport, we typically only hear of the successes, typically the championship performances or medals. We know very little about the dropouts, those who do so voluntarily, or those who are systematically excluded. There's some work in gymnastics. Those who drop out typically are physically bigger, earlier maturing, and so on. But that just gives you some hint of what's going on there. Sport is superimposed on the business of growing up. Children have to grow, they have to mature, they must learn to behave, and they interact. The behavioral domains are often overlooked Sport is exclusive. Talent development is complex. Specialization is limited with mixed effectiveness. Sports are operated by adults. Talented athletes, in many ways, are they pawns in this complex. What is also often overlooked, in my mind, young athletes are children and adolescents, and they have the needs of children and adolescents. All too often we overlook that. Thank you. Youngsters, believe me, have always participated in sport. This is a manuscript called Medieval Baseball. You look at the lower part, a boy is throwing a ball to a bat and looks like a teacher supervising it. This is 13th, 14th century. Youngsters have been doing this a long time. Thank you very much.